Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a totally simple, yet absolutely life-altering idea. The premise that tiny, systematic changes, when you repeat them consistently, lead to truly remarkable results. I mean, most of us grew up thinking that massive success requires massive action, right? But what if we've been looking at it completely backward this whole time? What if the real secret to unlocking your potential isn't about setting these gigantic, intimidating goals, but instead it's about mastering the smallest, almost invisible habits of your daily life? Well, let's dive into it and find out. So, why exactly do these microscopic changes lead to such remarkable outcomes? To really wrap our heads around this, we should look at a real-world case study. How do completely ordinary people, or even entire ordinary sports teams, transform into world champions? To answer that, we're going to look at the incredibly fascinating story of the British cycling team. 110. That is the number of years professional cycling in Great Britain spent wallowing in absolute mediocrity before 2003. Since 1908, they had managed to win just a single Olympic gold medal. And when it came to the Tour de France, cycling's absolute biggest stage, the record was even worse. In 110 years, literally no British cyclist had ever won the event. In fact, they were doing so poorly that a top European bike manufacturer actually refused to sell gear to them. They were terrified that seeing the British team riding their bikes would somehow hurt their sales. They were really at the bottom of the barrel. But then, enter Dave Brailsford. In 2003, he was hired to completely change the trajectory of British cycling. And Brailsford was different. He didn't walk in making these sweeping, revolutionary promises. Instead, he brought this relentless commitment to a radical strategy that he called the aggregation of marginal gains. It's a bit of a mouthful, but the whole philosophy was built on one incredibly simple concept. Break down every conceivable aspect of riding a bike and then figure out how to improve it by just 1%. The sheer level of detail Brailsford's team went into was honestly staggering. They didn't just stop at the obvious stuff. Sure, they redesigned the bike seats for comfort, and they rubbed alcohol on the tires for better grip, but they kept digging into these incredibly overlooked areas. I mean, they had riders wear electrically heated overshorts just to keep their muscle temperature absolutely perfect. They actually brought in a surgeon to teach the riders the optimal way to wash their hands so they wouldn't catch a cold. They even went as far as painting the entire inside of the team transport truck white just so they could easily spot tiny specks of dust that might mess up their finely tuned bikes. On their own, these seem kind of insignificant, right? But wait for this. Within just 5 years, this team completely dominated the 2008 Olympics, taking home 60% of the gold medals. By 2012, they were setting world records, and they eventually went on to win 5 Tour de France victories in just 6 years. Section 1, the math of improvement. Compounding tiny changes. You see, what happened with British cycling wasn't magic. It was math. It all boils down to this really staggering number, 37.78. Basically, habits are the compound interest of self-improvement. If you can manage to get just 1% better each day for one single year, you don't just get a little bit better. Because of compounding, you actually end up nearly 38 times better by the time the year is over. On the flip side, if you get 1% worse every day for a year, you basically decline all the way down to zero. As you can see right here on this graph, at the very beginning, the gap between getting 1% better and 1% worse is practically invisible. If you save a few bucks today, you're not instantly a millionaire. If you eat one unhealthy meal, the scale doesn't immediately jump. But over time, man, that curve separates dramatically. The impact of changing your habits is a lot like slightly shifting the route of an airplane. A tiny few degree shift at takeoff means you're going to land in a completely different city. Ultimately, success is the product of your daily habits, not these massive, once-in-a-lifetime transformations. But here is the catch. Time magnifies whatever you feed it. Habits act as a massive double-edged sword. They can compound for you, sure, but they can also compound against you. Positive compounding looks like maybe automating a few tasks to boost your productivity, or reading a little bit every day so your knowledge compounds over a lifetime. But negative compounding, that is just as real. Little daily stresses, like a bad commute or a tiny worry, those compound into serious health issues. A daily habit of negative self-talk compounds into a worldview where you just see everything through a really toxic lens. At the end of the day, you get exactly what you repeat. Section 2. The Valley of Disappointment. Waiting for breakthrough. So if the math is so incredibly clear, and the results are that dramatic, why on earth is it so hard for us to stick with good habits when we start them? Why do we always seem to give up after a week? Well, let's talk about something called the Valley of Disappointment. I want you to picture this. Imagine you're sitting in a freezing cold room. You can actually see your breath in the air. Sitting on a table right in front of you is a single ice cube. Right now, it's 25 degrees. but ever so slowly the room starts to heat up. 26 degrees, 27, 28 degrees. The temperature just keeps creeping up. 29, 30, 31 degrees. You've been putting in the heat, the environment around you is clearly changing, but you look down at the table and that ice cube is still just sitting there. Absolutely nothing has happened. And you know, this perfectly mirrors our frustration when we first try to build a new habit. We put in the work for a whole month, we look in the mirror and don't see our bodies changing, and we immediately feel like all our effort is totally useless. But then, 32 degrees, bam, the ice finally begins to melt. That tiny 1-degree shift, which honestly seemed completely identical to all the temperature increases before it, suddenly unlocks this massive change. The reality is, your previous efforts weren't wasted back at 26 or 29 degrees. They were simply being stored up. All the visible action, the big payoff, happens at 32 degrees. Looking at this plateau of latent potential here, you can see our problem. We naturally expect progress to be linear. We want it to be a straight line going up. But real progress actually follows this curved line underneath. This creates a massive gap in the early days of any habit, and that gap is the valley of disappointment. When you're stuck in this valley, you feel incredibly discouraged. You feel like throwing in the towel. But to hit that 32-degree breakthrough, you absolutely must persist past this plateau. Complaining about not seeing success early on is literally like complaining that your ice cube didn't melt at 29 degrees. You just have to let the potential build. Section 3. Systems over goals. Rethinking achievement. So how do we actually implement these tiny habits into our daily routines so we can survive that valley? We really need a macro-level pivot here. We have to completely rethink how we approach achievement. The standard wisdom in our culture tells us that if we want something, we need to set specific, actionable goals. But honestly, if you want better results, you actually need to forget about setting goals altogether and start focusing on your systems. Goals are just about the results you want to achieve, like winning a championship. Systems are about the actual processes that lead to those results. How your team practices, how you recruit, how you train day in and day out. It is absolutely crucial to recognize the trap of just setting goals. For one thing, winners and losers basically have the exact same goals. Every athlete at the Olympics wants the gold medal, right? So the goal itself clearly isn't what separates them. Secondly, achieving a goal is really only a momentary change. Think about it. If your room is a mess and you finally summon the energy to clean it, great, you have a clean room for one day. But if you don't change the messy habits, your system, that room is going to be a complete disaster again by tomorrow. You've basically just treated a symptom without curing the disease. Building a system, on the other hand, fixes the problem right at the root. It lets you fall in love with the process and enjoy continuous refinement instead of just yo-yoing back and forth. Because ultimately, you do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems. Section 4. The 3 layers of change. Changing who you are. Let's look at how all this builds into the deepest application of habit formation. We're going to shift gears from just looking at our daily actions to literally changing the core of who we are. As you can see, change happens in 3 distinct layers. The outermost layer is changing your outcomes, things like losing weight or publishing a book. That's what you get. The middle layer is changing your processes, like starting a new gym routine or decluttering your workspace. That's what you do. But the deepest, innermost layer, that's changing your identity. This is all about your worldview, your self-image, and your deeply held beliefs. This is about who you believe you are. To really see the difference, imagine 2 people trying to turn down a cigarette. The first person says, "No thanks, I'm trying to quit." Notice how they're entirely focused on the outcome. Deep down, they still believe they are a smoker who is just temporarily trying to do something else. But the second person, they simply say, "No thanks, I'm not a smoker." Wow, that is a tiny shift in language, but it signals a massive shift in identity. Smoking is a part of their past life, not their current one. Most of us start our habit journeys by focusing on the outcome we want, but lasting change only ever happens when it becomes identity-based. You really have to keep this rule in mind. Behavior that is incongruent with the self will not last. It's that simple. You can want more money, but if your core identity is someone who consumes rather than creates, you're always going to drift right back to spending. You can want to get in shape, but if your identity prioritizes comfort over accomplishment, you're always going to end up skipping the workout. You can set a shiny new goal and draft up a perfect plan, but if you do not change the underlying beliefs that drove your past behavior, your old identity is eventually going to step in and totally sabotage your progress. Which brings us to our final thought today. The true underlying power of an atomic habit isn't just that it magically gets you a 1% better result today. No, It's that every single time you perform that habit, you are actively casting a vote for the type of person you wish to become. Doing one workout doesn't instantly transform your body, but that one visit casts a powerful vote that you are an athlete. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want you to ask yourself, are your current daily systems casting votes for the identity you actually want? Because at the end of the day, true behavior change is identity change. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I highly encourage you to start looking for your own 1% improvements today.